They didn't expect him to answer. When Donald Trump made global headlines announcing a sweeping repatriation plan targeting thousands of undocumented Africans, the world braced for diplomatic silence from the continent. But Ibrahim Traoré had other plans. He didn't hold a press conference. He didn't issue a statement filled with cautious diplomacy. He simply walked into the central bank of Burkina Faso and signed one of the boldest decisions in African economic history. With a stroke of a pen, he paid off every single foreign debt his country owed, clearing the books, cutting the chains, and sending a message louder than any press release. We don't need to beg. We don't need to run. We will never be deported from a world we built. In that moment, Burkina Faso did what most global South countries only dreamed of. It unshackled itself completely from external control. The IMF, the World Bank, bilateral creditors, none of them could call anymore. No interest payments, no loan conditions, no structural adjustment policies hidden in smiling aid. Just freedom. Economic, political, psychological freedom. And the timing was no accident. Traoré's move came not just as a response to Trump's harsh rhetoric, but as a declaration of ideological war against the old order that kept Africa begging. For years, leaders had whispered about sovereignty. Traoré demonstrated it. While others waited for permission, he moved with precision. The world was stunned. International economists rushed to frame it as risky. Pundits called it financially irresponsible. But inside Burkina Faso, the streets erupted, not in fear, but in pride. People poured into markets with Burkinabe flags. Musicians dropped tracks praising the debt destroyer. Elders wept at the idea that their grandchildren might grow up in a nation that owed nothing to anyone. But this wasn't about one country's balance sheet. It was about the beginning of a continental shift. Because once Burkina Faso proved it could walk away from the debt table and still stand, every other African nation started questioning their own shares. What if they too stopped asking for budget support and started building with what they had? What if they stopped fearing credit scores and started trusting their people's creativity? Traoré didn't just answer Trump. He answered centuries of exploitation, manipulation, and humiliation with one undeniable act. He showed that sovereignty isn't declared. It's funded. It's budgeted. It's lived. And once it's lived, no border, no deportation, no foreign decree can erase it. If this bold move shook you too, comment "We owe no one" and like this video. Because what comes next isn't just financial freedom, it's a blueprint for the return of true dignity. It didn't take long for the ripple effect to begin. As news spread that Traoré had wiped out Burkina Faso's foreign debt in one bold, quiet move, the air across the continent changed. No more interest payments. No more waiting for permission to spend their own resources. The streets of Ouagadougou weren't filled with protest. They were filled with purpose. Street vendors held up signs reading, "We owe no one." Local artists painted murals of a giant hand tearing up loan documents. In schools, teachers turned economics lessons into history classes about the moment Burkina Faso broke free. And the people understood something deeper than numbers. This wasn't just about debt. It was about dignity. Because for generations, debt had been more than financial. It had been mental. Young Africans grew up believing that poverty was their inheritance and loans were their only ticket to progress. Every budget had a footnote from abroad. Every hospital depended on grants. Every school book was stamped with a donor logo. And now, for the first time, a government stood up and said, "We're done." That moment cracked something open. A silence that had lingered across Africa for decades. The silence of knowing you're capable, but told you must ask, was broken. People began to speak differently. They didn't ask what the IMF thought. They asked what they could build with what they had. And that question alone was revolutionary. But make no mistake, Traoré's move didn't come without risk. The same global institutions that once praised his calls for reform now watched him with narrowed eyes. Articles appeared questioning Burkina Faso's financial future. Think tanks labeled the move unsustainable. Some even implied sanctions might be necessary if the country refused to return to negotiation. But Traoré didn't flinch. He released a statement, just 4 words long. "Our freedom is priceless." And those 4 words echoed across borders. In Ghana, Street poets recited them from balconies. In Nigeria, social media exploded with hashtags. In Mali, a youth coalition projected it onto a government building. The idea was no longer confined to Burkina Faso. It was becoming a continental language, a new dialect of determination. Even in the diaspora, African communities began rethinking remittances, business models, investments. Because what Traoré had done wasn't just symbolic, it was systemic. He forced the world to confront a truth it had buried beneath spreadsheets, that debt is not just numbers. It is narrative. A story that says, you must always ask. Traoré burned that story and wrote a new one in bold letters. We build, we pay, we own. If this part awakens something inside you, come in at Freedom has no interest rate. Like this video and help others see that liberation doesn't march, it calculates. While the people celebrated and the continent stirred, the old financial empires grew uneasy. Behind the polished walls of global institutions, memos were circulated urgently. Burkina Faso exits debt agreement structure. Traoré rejects post-loan stabilization framework. Market response unpredictable. But what truly rattled them wasn't just the cleared accounts. It was what those empty accounts meant for control. For decades, debt had been the leash used to steer African policies. It came with elegant names like structural adjustment or development finance. But at its core, it was about influence. And now that influence had been cut loose, not with protest, but with precision. There was no shouting, no rallying, no dramatic standoff. Just numbers zeroed out. Just contracts canceled. Just quiet exits from systems designed to keep hands tied. And in that silence, the panic began to grow. Media outlets attempted to contain the narrative. Burkina Faso's financial future uncertain, read one Western headline. Populist gamble, claimed another. But inside Africa, the tone was different. Editorials celebrated. Elders nodded. Youth began questioning everything they'd been taught about economics. If Burkina Faso could do it, why not others? Why keep importing debt like it's medicine when the side effects are control, surveillance, and submission? Suddenly, universities across the continent saw a surge in interest for courses in sovereign finance. Economists once marginalized for proposing internal development models were now on TV. Farmers discussed bond-free budgeting in village meetings. It was as if Traoré hadn't just paid off debt, he had lit a fuse that ran beneath every nation still bowing under foreign conditions. And the irony wasn't lost on anyone. Trump had spoken of deporting Africans as a punishment. Traoré responded by removing the real chain, debt. One was a threat of displacement, the other an act of empowerment. That contrast forced even the skeptics to pause, because there is no visa policy strong enough to counter national pride, no border wall tall enough to stop the return of self-worth. While Western pundits debated GDP risks, Traoré's cabinet quietly rolled out the next phase, redirecting all former debt payments into local investment, not for international applause, but for internal impact. Roads, clinics, agri-projects, local manufacturers given first priority in state contracts. It wasn't flashy, it was functional. And function was all Burkina Faso ever needed. If this part made you realize that debt wasn't just financial, it was philosophical. Comment, we cancel control. Like this video and let it reach everyone, still taught that freedom must be borrowed. Something remarkable began to happen in the weeks following Traoré's historic move. Not on trading floors or in international press rooms, but in the hearts and habits of ordinary Burkinabe citizens. For the first time in living memory, people felt like the government wasn't negotiating on their behalf. It was building with them. Every family knew what it meant to be free from debt. It meant their taxes would no longer be sent across borders in the name of repayment. It meant public budgets were finally public again, not dictated by distant technocrats, but drafted by local priorities. And that change wasn't just technical, it was personal. Street sweepers, shopkeepers, farmers, teachers, they all began talking differently. Instead of saying when they send aid, they said when we invest this year. The pronoun changed, and with it, the entire narrative. Across the country, small businesses began to spring up. Cafes named Sovereign Roast, tailoring shops called No Chains. In schools, students debated how to keep the country self-funded. Let's tax wealth before borrowing, one said. Let's train engineers instead of hiring them, another added. This wasn't idealism, it was planning. Because when a nation clears its debts, it doesn't just remove interest payments. It restores interest in itself. That new interest grew quickly. Community centers held budget forums. Farmers' unions sent proposals to local governments. Women's groups demanded access to funding once redirected to loan obligations. And instead of being ignored, they were invited to participate. This was what freedom looked like. Messy, engaged, noisy, and authentic. Meanwhile, Traoré remained consistent. He didn't over-celebrate the debt payoff. He treated it as a beginning, not an end. Now that we're free, he told his cabinet, let's act like it. And act they did. Within days, ministries announced audits of all foreign-funded projects. Not to cancel them, but to bring them under national review. What was useful would be continued. What was extractive would be stopped. No drama, just discernment. And that mature posture stunned observers. How could a so-called underdeveloped country show such clarity? The answer was simple. They had no more creditors to impress. They only had citizens to serve. And in that service, a new kind of politics emerged. One that didn't beg, didn't boast, didn't bluff. Just build. Build with what was there. Build knowing no loan officer could interfere. Build knowing every mistake would be theirs, and every success too. That ownership is rare. But in Burkina Faso, it became routine. If this part made you feel that freedom isn't a speech, but a system you grow into, comment, "We build because we're free." Like this video and let others feel what it means to stand on your own budget. The moment Burkina Faso shook off the weight of foreign debt, the doors to something far more powerful opened. Self-production. No longer tied to funding cycles or project frameworks written in distant boardrooms, the government turned its full attention inward. What do we import that we can build? What do we rent that we can own? And those questions didn't stay rhetorical. They turned into policy. Traoré launched the National Substitution Initiative, a plan to replace imported goods and services with local alternatives. Not in 5 years, immediately. First came construction. Instead of importing cement from abroad, factories were reopened. Burkinabe engineers were hired to design eco-friendly mixtures using local materials. Road projects began sourcing 90% of inputs locally. Then came agriculture. With food import bills no longer hidden under debt statements, the nation faced the reality of its own consumption. Burkina Faso was importing tomatoes, onions, even rice, while thousands of hectares sat underused. Traoré's government launched a campaign, Feed Ourselves First. Lands were redistributed to cooperatives. Irrigation systems, once paused due to funding constraints, were completed in months. The country went from importing vegetables to selling surplus to neighbors, and the people noticed. For the first time, the market stalls were full of food grown by hands they recognized. Not foreign labels, familiar faces. That recognition sparked a deeper shift. Buying local became more than a slogan. It became a duty, a joy, a rebellion against the idea that development must come in shipping containers. Even school uniforms, once imported from Asia, were now made by Burkinabe textile cooperatives. The savings were real, the pride even more so. Women-led tailoring businesses doubled in size. Young designers opened fashion labs that combined tradition with innovation. And all of it was fueled by one thing: freedom from debt. Because when every franc doesn't leave the country as interest, it stays, it circulates, it builds. Critics abroad were silent now. Their predictions of collapse had not come true. Burkina Faso hadn't fallen, it had risen. And quietly other countries took note. Delegations arrived from Niger, Benin, Sierra Leone. They didn't come with offers, they came with notebooks. They wanted to understand how a country could cut its financial umbilical cord and still grow stronger. The answer was everywhere: markets, machines, children in uniforms made at home. This wasn't aid, this wasn't survival, this was strategy. And Traoré knew it. He said, "We don't need to outspend the world. We just need to outbelieve it." That belief was now policy. If this part made you realize that development begins the moment dependency ends, Comment, we feed, we build, we earn. Like this video and let others know, you don't need loans to grow, you need belief in a blueprint. While Burkina Faso was building inward, something deeper was unfolding. An awakening not in government offices, but in everyday conversations. People began looking at their country differently. What was once dismissed as too small, too dry, or too poor was now viewed as untapped, underutilized, and ready. That mental shift was more valuable than any infrastructure. Because once people see worth in their own soil, their own ideas, their own hands, they stop outsourcing their future. And that realization spread faster than any loan document ever could. Children walked to school in shoes made by Burkinabe hands. Farmers harvested tools designed by local engineers. Mechanics repaired motorcycles with spare parts forged in domestic foundries. And all of this wasn't fantasy. It was happening. Because without debt, there was finally fiscal oxygen. Space to breathe, space to try, space to fail and learn. That was what the old system never allowed. Freedom without fear of penalties. Now, mistakes were part of growth, not excuses for punishment. Ministries encouraged innovation. If a project failed, it wasn't buried. It was studied, improved, relaunched. That courage to build without begging turned Burkina Faso into something rare. A country defining its own pace. And that pace was making powerful people nervous. Behind the scenes, global think tanks began quietly issuing warnings. Burkina Faso may set a precedent. Other African nations watching closely. Debt resistance spreading ideologically. They didn't fear default, they feared demonstration. Because if one country could prove that you don't need to borrow to build, then every nation still in chains would start rattling them. That's why the pressure changed form. It wasn't direct, it was subtle. Trade barriers disguised as compliance gaps. Investment ratings quietly downgraded. Foreign correspondents suddenly concerned about transparency. But none of it stuck. Because Traoré didn't just cancel debt, he built trust. Not with foreign markets, but with his people. Weekly financial briefings were made public. Procurement contracts published online. Civil servants were trained not just in management, but in mindfulness. Understanding the weight of handling a free nation's money. That weight wasn't fear, it was honor. In villages, children reenacted scenes of Traoré signing the final debt payment. In cities, musicians sampled his words, "We owe no one, we build for all." Those lyrics became anthems. The anthems became fuel, and the fuel became forward motion. Meanwhile, international media still couldn't figure out how Burkina Faso hadn't collapsed. Where was the chaos? The inflation? The social unrest? It didn't exist. Because what they forgot to measure was belief. And belief, once planted in free soil, doesn't need permission to grow. If this part makes you feel that freedom isn't gifted, it's grown from within, comment, we grow from within. Like this video and let others feel what happens when a country finally inhales its own air. They used to laugh. In boardrooms, in briefings, in donor meetings, they joked about self-reliance as romantic nonsense. They said no African country could operate outside the financial grid. But now, no one was laughing. Burkina Faso hadn't just survived debt cancellation. It had reorganized itself, reawakened its people, and reignited the question that frightened global powers most. What if more countries walk away? Because it was no longer just about economics. It was about a breach in the narrative. A crack in the carefully painted picture of Africa as perpetually dependent. That crack grew with every road paved, every loan payment that no longer existed, every citizen who stopped saying they and started saying we. The Burkina model had become something more than a set of policies. It was now a symbol that moved quietly but with force. Delegations from other African nations didn't visit Ouagadougou for tours. They came for blueprints. They wanted to understand how a government could say no to the world and still hear yes from its people. The answer was simpler than expected. Dignity, measured not in GDP points, but in participation. In families who no longer feared eviction because a structural reform cut their subsidy. In children who saw local names on their textbooks instead of logos from agencies they didn't understand. That shift created a loop. Belief led to action. Action led to results. Results led to more belief. And once that loop takes root, control becomes almost impossible. That's what worried the old world. Because when fear no longer works, neither does manipulation. They tried every tactic, raising alarms about security, hinting at instability, suggesting mismanagement. But nothing stuck, because the streets were not screaming, they were working. The markets were not empty, they were local. The people were not restless, they were building. And quietly, confidently, other leaders began to take notes. Presidents once mocked for resisting foreign banks now pointed to Burkina Faso and asked, what if they were right? Economists' silence for challenging the debt regime now found new audiences. The momentum was no longer a wave, it was a tide, and tides reshape shorelines. Burkina Faso, once considered marginal, was now defining the margin itself, redrawing the lines between what was realistic and what was simply perpetuated. And Traoré? He didn't gloat. He visited schools, he walked among farmers, he instructed ministers not to compare Burkina Faso with others, but with its own yesterday. Outdo yourself, not your neighbor, he said. That mindset killed the competition narrative. Because Burkina Faso wasn't trying to win the race, it was running its own. And every meter forward was built, not borrowed. If this part made you realize that the most powerful rebellion is building without permission, comment, we run our race. Like this video and let others feel the quiet strength of those who choose sovereignty over spectacle. The strongest part of Traoré's revolution wasn't what was seen. It was what couldn't be stopped. Because once a nation gains control over its own finances, it becomes impossible to predict, pressure, or pilot from outside. That's what happened with Burkina Faso. The international community didn't just lose a borrower, they lost a handle. Before any disagreement could be tamed with delayed disbursements or frozen accounts. Now there was no switch to flip. The money was local, the plans were local, the results were real. And when you can't control a country through its debts, you start fearing its decisions. Because suddenly every policy is genuinely theirs. Every reform reflects the will of the people, not the wording of a funding agreement. That scared them. They couldn't calculate what came next. And that unpredictability, once assumed to be dangerous, was now deliberate. Burkina Faso didn't want to fit into anyone's model. It wanted to build one of its own. A model where freedom isn't something you perform on Independence Day. It's something you budget, allocate, and measure. That's why ministries weren't focused on foreign conferences. They were focused on village water projects, domestic software, local transportation hubs, all funded internally, all maintained by local hands. The government began shifting procurement laws, giving priority to national producers even if they cost more. Let the money circulate at home first, Traoré declared, and that decision energized a new class of entrepreneurs. Young Burkinabe began launching businesses with confidence, not just because the market was growing, but because the state was finally structured to protect them. No sudden tax spikes from IMF recommendations, no donor reshuffles cutting social support. Stability became the norm, not the dream. And when stability arrives, so does planning. Families began saving more. Local banks saw higher deposits. Communities launched their own development councils. From small villages to regional centers, a new rhythm took hold. Build what you can, where you are, with what you have. That principle, simple yet powerful, turned into national gospel. It was repeated in classrooms, sermons, speeches, and songs. Meanwhile, global agencies tried to regain relevance. They offered technical support with no strings attached. They praised Traoré's homegrown innovation while hoping for a seat at the next roundtable. But Burkina Faso had already moved on. They weren't bitter, they were busy. Because when you finally walk freely, you don't turn around to explain your pace. You focus on the road ahead, and that road was no longer imagined. It was visible, measurable, lined with toll booths built without loans, schools powered by community solar, clinics stocked by local pharmaceutical labs. This wasn't a miracle, it was management. And that truth shattered every stereotype. If this part made you understand that true rebellion is quiet competence, comment, we manage our freedom. Like this video and remind the world, when the noise fades, structure speaks. It all began with a signature, a pen to a page, a man refusing to let his people's future be collateral for someone else's past. When Ibrahim Traoré walked into the central bank and paid off every foreign debt Burkina Faso owed, he didn't just clear a balance sheet, he reset a belief system. He shattered the invisible ceiling over African ambition and replaced it with scarcity, because from that moment on, every child born in Burkina Faso would grow up in a country that owed no one. That kind of freedom cannot be measured in interest rates. It can only be lived in dignity, in planning, in confidence. And across the continent, others began to dream with eyes open. They stopped asking, "Can we do this?" and started saying, "Why haven't we already?" Traoré didn't offer them cash. He gave them something far more valuable. Proof that a country doesn't collapse when it stops borrowing. It begins that the real credit rating is not in Western indexes, but in how well your people eat, learn, move, and dream. And Burkina Faso was now rich, in trust, in vision, in rhythm. But don't mistake this for utopia. The roads are still dusty, the struggles still real. What changed is not the terrain, but the direction. For once, they were no longer walking in circles dictated by loans. They were marching forward on their terms. And that direction changed everything. Because it showed that Africa's problem was never capability, it was captivity. Not of the body, but of the budget, of the imagination. And Traoré broke that chain without firing a shot. Just a budget rebalanced, a mindset reawakened, a government restructured. This is what leadership looks like when it believes in its people more than in promises made across oceans. And now that belief is spreading, quietly, firmly, irreversibly. The question is no longer what Traoré did, it's what the rest of us are willing to do. Are we willing to stop waiting, to stop begging, to stop outsourcing hope? Or will we finally say, we are the loan we've been waiting for? Because the truth is, no one's coming to save Africa. But maybe, just maybe, Africa is coming to save itself. If this story moves something inside you, comment, "We are the credit." Like this video. Share it with someone who thinks sovereignty is just a flag. Subscribe for more truths they won't teach you in school. Because history is being written, and this time Africa holds the pen.